from the island of Borneo, right? For those of you not familiar with Borneo, it's sandwiched in between Indonesia and the Philippines, kind of, roughly. It's the third largest island in the world, and one fact which is not known to most people, it's actually the first or second oldest rainforest in the world. It's about 130 to 140 million years old, this rainforest, and it's much, much older, perhaps by about 70 to 80 million years as compared to the Amazon, which everyone knows about. So this region was my home for the first 16 to 17 years of my life, right? And reflecting back, it's a region full of phenomenal biodiversity, having been largely cut off from other parts of mainland Asia for a very long time. And, if you look at the species diversity chart, you will see that, yes, there are a number of mammals and birds and reptiles and so on and so forth, but you'll see a significant proportion of them are endemic to Borneo. That is, you find them only there and nowhere else. I think some of the species which everyone is familiar with, at least second one, the orangutan, which is there not only on Borneo but in other parts of Southeast Asia. And perhaps lesser known is the monkey on the bottom right. It's called the proboscis monkey, and that's only seen in Borneo and nowhere else. So why I'm bringing in this story is that, consciously or subconsciously, this fact has had an impact on my personal journey and leading me up to where I am today, that is, talking to all of you on this topic. Just to continue the story, I left the island of Borneo. My father was there in Borneo for nearly 40 years, right? And he was a veterinary officer, and is very familiar with the animal life there, including a number of things which are going on today, like swine flu, avian flu, and so on, being a field veterinary surgeon. We left Brunei, and that is Borneo, in 1985. Now, Borneo was 90% forest, 90 to 95% forest at one point. And by the time I left, you can see the figure, these are actual figures obtained through satellite imagery. In 1985, 86, it was still probably around 80% or more. Fast forward to 2020, you can see the immense deforestation which has happened on the island of Borneo as a consequence of man-made activities. If you look at the picture on the right, I think there's been a lot of focus on the wildfires in Australia of late. But I think the wildfires on the island of Borneo, you can see the hotspots related to organic carbon emissions due to PM 2.5 owing to uncontrolled fires in 2019 is very significant. And, we kind of tend to ignore stuff that happens in Asia as well. I think the impact of climate change, deforestation is a lot more rampant here. And why I'm bringing this story as a precursor is because, we talk of climate change, a lot of it from a human-centric point of view, right? And for me, I personally relate to what I see as, because I still have lots of close childhood friends who stay there, and I have seen now a destruction of a pristine environment, the oldest rainforest in the world, within just half my lifetime. Now, using this as context, so a number of these thoughts have influenced me, and over the years, I've been working as an IT professional for about 26 years, working in a number of fields, and recently I did have the opportunity to go and work in the green energy technology field on electric mobility, batteries, and so on and so forth. I think all of these are a culmination of, I think, a growing passion and a sense of personal urgency to look at this topic and see how best I can help in my own small, tiny little way, at least as far as in terms of communicating what I personally see as impacts and what we can collectively do as engineers, as individuals, as people to address this. So there have been certain inspirations in my life, right, which have influenced me on embarking on this topic. With kids out of the house, I have a lot more time now to focus on matters that really matter, on things that really matter, right? And this really matters to me, and I wish, and I'm sure it will, to each one of you. Folks who have greatly influenced me, because I had the privilege of watching Sir David Attenborough for nearly the last 40 plus years on TV. We had TV when I was growing up, so I always grew up every Sunday afternoon watching his programs. And he's probably the greatest naturalist and communicator related to the natural world and its impact and the impact of climate change on the natural world that we have today. I'm sure many of you have seen his programs or heard him on TV. If not, please do. Another is a fantastic lady, Elizabeth Kolbert, who wrote this Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Sixth Extinction. Right? It's a very profound piece of work that talks of human impact and leading to climate change today, man-made climate change. And a follow-on book, Field Notes from a Catastrophe. I'm very privileged to have a personally authored copy from her of this book. Two very profound books, in-depth research material, which I think has influenced me a lot, and that's why I'm here today, to talk about this very important topic and to share my little world and my small sets of perspectives with each one of you. So if I was to coin something about climate change, I would coin it as follows, right? So climate change, I've just abbreviated it as C squared, C2, right, is a globally pervasive, borderless phenomenon owing to man-made energy imbalance, resulting in the unnatural extinction of species in the natural world, along with unnatural, within quotes, landscaping of the geographical environment. This is what is happening in front of our very eyes. It's happening at an exponentially increasing rate, but not at a rate at which, we think fast should be. But believe it or not, based on my personal experience where I've seen pristine rainforests destroyed in half my lifetime, I think this is something for each one of us to take serious note of. So having said this and provided a little bit of background as to where I am coming from on this topic, let me move on to how IEEE, how specifically we are trying to organize the HTC Humanitarian Technologies Conference, as Puneet mentioned, which will be held in Vijayapura, erstwhile Bijapur, in the month of October 2020, hopefully, assuming if all our COVID situation and all settles down. So the backdrop for that is a series of tracks which are derived from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, so SDGs, right? The specific areas that I'm tasked with in learning myself and sharing whatever little I know on these topics are specifically SDGs 13, which is on climate change, 7 on affordable and clean energy, and 4 on quality education. Keeping these three topics in mind, I'm just going to jump to the next part of the presentation where I'm going to be taking a little bit of a step back. I know the topic started off, the headline of the topic was on rural, but I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and provide a slightly macro level view before we get back to, specific nitty-gritties in today's talk, as well as much more in detail in tomorrow's sessions on affordable clean energy and education with respect to rural. The way I look at it is I see everything is connected. From my window, or from my perspective, I see everything is connected. I see climate change as a topic of understanding, education, and clean energy all interlinked together. So I just have my little acronym for this, C cube E squared. Being an engineer, we love to have our little acronyms, perhaps mathematically inclined if possible. So C cube E squared is climate change, clean energy, so the three C's there, and clean energy and education, so the two E's there. So that's my little acronym, which you will see me using in the slides going forward, just to save space and just to make it a little easier to read, hopefully. So what I'm going to cover first is on climate change, right? So I'm going to be baselining, because it's important that all of us have the same baseline understanding, right? I have a view of the understanding. It's definitely not the only view, but it's my view, which I would like to share, right? And over the course of today, over the course of the next many weeks, and as we interact with each other in the conference, and more importantly after that, multiple views will come about, right? So what I wanted to focus on are a few key tenets that help to qualify and quantify what's climate change, what's the cost, and what are the effects. What I find is, as I interact with young engineers coming out of college or in the workplace on a day-to-day basis, while this topic is seen on television and it's seen as a topic of hot debate at the political and other areas, I think there is somewhat of not enough in-depth information. It's very superficial at the discussions at times. So I think I would like to spend a little time just scratching the surface a little more. Right? And why I'm stepping away from rural right now is because I believe, and I think there's enough evidence for that, is climate change has no borders. There is no distinction between rural or urban, land, air, or sea. What's local has an impact globally. What's global obviously has an impact locally, and so on and so forth. Now, tied in with this climate change is clean energy, right? Because going back to my little definition, it's due to man-made energy imbalance. So I'll talk about that a little bit today, and in tomorrow's session, I'll talk about a little bit more about clean energy. What's appropriate in certain contexts? What are the delivery and consumption models? A very important element to address this issue of climate change and clean energy is also education. In my mind, education is multidimensional, multifaceted. So I will talk about what's relevant, who's the audience, delivery mechanisms, but more importantly, as I will detail tomorrow, is I view education as a two-way street between urban and rural to urban. I think it would be too arrogant for us living in urban communities to assume that we have all the solutions and we have all the know-how related to how to address climate change in a broader sense. So I will spend a little bit of time talking about that as well tomorrow. For today, I will focus a little bit more on the topic of climate change. As I mentioned in the initial part, there is an energy imbalance. How do we see the energy imbalance? Primarily, our energy structures, for the most part of the industrialized time, starting from coal to burning of fossil fuels, specifically oil and gas, right, is the energy imbalance I'm talking about. And that's measured, or its effects are measured now increasingly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The most famous being carbon dioxide, methane, along with other nitrous gases and so on. Right? Let's take a step back. So why do I call it man-made energy imbalance? And why do I say it's going to lead to unnatural extinction? Rewind back 1 million years. You can even rewind back much further beyond that. Right? You will see that through Arctic cores and Antarctic cores, people have measured gaseous concentrations over vast millennia. And by and large, it's stayed below 300 parts per million over the last 1 million to 5 million years. I mean, the last time carbon dioxide is at the level today was probably about 5 to 8 million years ago. I believe it's in the Pleistocene age. I don't have it on this chart, but I'm sure you can look it up. Look at the natural variation versus if you look at the right-hand side of the top chart, you will see a spike. It's almost a vertical spike from about what we studied in school. I still remember studying in school 330 parts per million, right? And unfortunately, the syllabus hasn't got updated in any of the schools. They still refer to carbon dioxide level as 330 parts per million. The reality is today it's probably around 420 parts per million and climbing very, very fast. Let's also look at greenhouse gas emissions owing to methane production, right? So methane comes from a variety of sources. I'll cover that a little later. And, that's also an increasing contributor towards warming the planet. So net, we are producing emissions related to carbon dioxide, methane. We are generating energy output far more than what Mother Nature and the Earth can absorb. So there is a net balance which is growing gradually. In an example given by a very famous climate scientist who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and he gave a talk in Australia to a whole audience of climate skeptics. He gave a beautiful example of a bathtub which was gradually filling up, and the outlet of the bathtub had a little smaller hole. So there was always a net accumulation of water. That's exactly what's happening to the Earth today. There's a net accumulation of greenhouse gases, which results in warming. Now, what's the share of energy? Which are the components that result in generation of these greenhouse gases? Right? The very popular ones everybody knows, right? It's fossil fuels, oil, right, which we use in automobiles, jets, diesel generators, come what may. Natural gas, in increasing component, right? There are lots of debates around natural gas. Yes, burning gas perhaps produces far less emissions. But the interesting story that doesn't always get told is what is required to produce the natural gas. It comes at a cost. Then there is coal, which has been around for a couple of 100 years, right? And a lot of coal power plants have been powered up over the many decades. And a significant portion of India's energy itself comes from coal power plants. Then there is nuclear, still a small fraction. And in my personal opinion, I think it has a very important story in the years and decades to come, though there are safety concerns. But this is my personal view. I think we need to pay significant attention to nuclear at some point. Hydro. Hydro is an interesting story because with the greenhouse gas emissions, you will find the capacity of storing by rivers, the damming and the negative influences of that all are resulting perhaps in fluctuating hydroelectric power and renewables. So there are a number of these, energy sources that we have, and this chart is just reflecting, energy consumption in billions of TOEs, right? Is my audio still there?
You are audible.
My audio still?
Yes, your audio is there. You are able to hear us?
I can, yeah. I just wanted to check, sorry.
Yeah.
Let's look at the social and economic impacts of climate change, right? So I'm not going to cover each one of these in detail. Is the audio okay now? Somebody put on the chat that it was breaking. Is everybody able to hear me okay? All right, okay. I see that in the chat it's okay. All right. So one of the things that I'm going to cover a few of these. You'll get these slides offline so you can take a look, right? The first thing is sea level rises, right? Be owing to temperature increments, melting of caps and so on and so forth. This is a real problem. There are already cities in Asia, the notable example being Jakarta, where they are even planning to move, and they are in the process of moving the capital city out. About a quarter of Jakarta is now inundated by seawater on a frequent basis. There are other areas of Indonesia which are significantly impacted owing to rising sea levels. If you look at Indonesia as a country, and why I go to Indonesia, it's a very populous country. I think it's about the fifth most populous country in the world, 250 odd million odd people. About 60 to 70 million people are in danger of losing their homes over the next 15 to 20 years. 60 to 70 million people. Because the bulk of Indonesia population lives around the coast. This is a real threat because the Indonesian government is struggling to figure out what to do with 60 to 70 million people who may eventually have to relocate and move somewhere. The question is where. Right? If you're not talking, can you kindly mute, please? Thank you. So that is one primary example, right? The other one, which is very well known, which we see in Bangalore on a yearly basis and increasingly on in other areas of India and the world, is the availability of fresh water. Right? Fresh water is only 1 to 2% of total available water on the planet, and we are depleting it at an alarming rate. One is owing to consumption, the other is owing to the stress by temperature increases, erratic rainfalls, and so on and so forth, all which are consequences of climate change. Diseases spreading out. Yeah, we are now in a time of an extraordinary disease. I can't say that this is anywhere connected to climate change, but there are other vector-borne diseases, specifically like mosquito-borne diseases, which will be increasingly prevalent in a warming planet. And that's already being seen in many areas of the world, including in the US, where, decades ago, nobody talked about fogging for mosquitoes. Now, there's frequent fogging of mosquitoes even in the US owing to imported vectors as well as increasing temperatures. Relocation of whole towns, we talked about that. Meteorological phenomena will cause widespread poverty. I think we are already starting to see that, right? Dislocation of populations owing to rising sea levels, owing to desertification of various areas. You will see that especially in some regions of Africa. If you go to Central Africa, a little towards the northern part of Central Africa, around Niger and Chad. If you look at Lake Chad, it's just a fraction of what it was before, and about 20 to 30 million people depend on that for water, and there's almost no water left. So some of these are already here. The social and economic impacts of climate change. That's at the human level. Fortunately or unfortunately, whenever we talk of climate change, we tend to focus on the human side, right? As a species, we're kind of sometimes narrowly centered around that. But I think we ought to take a step back, and I took this quote from the Huffington Post, which is very true, in my opinion, that the decline of the natural world is actually a crisis even bigger than climate change. Climate has always changed in history. The question is, this is an unnatural forcing function which has come into place. And the ones affected by it definitely are humans. If you take the humans out of the equation, I think the planet and the rest of the species will probably be fine, right? So I think we need to see that in a larger perspective. It's like today's COVID situation, right? It's us who are getting impacted. So if we take ourselves out of the equation, I think everybody else or everything else on the planet is doing all right. Okay, so it's important to put this context whenever we talk about climate change and stop having only human-centric discussions. So what is getting impacted? Right, let's look at water. We talked a little bit about that before. There's temperature rise and there's population stress, right, due to movement of people. I mean, they're all interconnected. It's difficult to start at one place, and say that that's a starting point. It's almost sometimes all of them are in a circular loop between population migration, between depletion of resources, between, unavailability of fresh water. They all are connected together, right? And if you were to characterize it, yes, there's groundwater depletion. We are taking a lot of water out of the earth without having the ability to recharge it adequately. Aquifers getting dry. Sometimes there's subsidence in those aquifers, that is, they collapse and no longer are functional, right? And pollution as well, right, which creeps in, when you extract too much groundwater. There's a lot of seepage from other things which are there in the soil and the rocks. Right. An example here in Delhi, I mean, this is not true of just Delhi, this is true of Bangalore, this is true of Chennai. Last year, the year before, Chennai pretty much ran out of water. We see this challenge year on year in Bangalore. We've seen it in Hyderabad before and all cities, right? And there's no real clarity on how much water is available, what we need to do, and what action has to be taken. There is some limited action taken by government, but I think this is something collectively that each one of us as individuals need to address. Ocean acidification. This is a very interesting topic because nobody can see ocean acidification. So we tend to ignore it. When you go to the ocean or sea, you don't see bubbling pots of sulfuric acid or nitric acid, right? You don't see that, right? So what are we talking about with respect to ocean acidification? Owing to increasing temperature and increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there's a lot more absorption by the oceans, right? That's what leads to ocean acidification. It is very gradual, but it is now having a profound impact on the entire food chain because it's happened very fast, and studies have been done in areas where there are underground volcanic vents, right, which emit sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, thermal vents, and people have correlated those studies to what will happen in the larger oceans as the ocean gradually acidifies owing to absorption of carbon dioxide. It impacts the entire food chain, starting from phytoplankton to krill to what food fish can eat, and the entire predatory cycle up top bottom, right? So that's another significant impact. What's another area of impact, right? What does temperature really mean apart from causing inconvenience to us humans, right? It impacts the soil, impacts biodiversity, right? What happens to the soil due to increased temperatures, rampant grazing, monoculture, lot of use of pesticides, lack of recycling back valuable organic matter naturally back into the system. You will find a number of videos. I encourage you to go and look at it online. There is a microclimate that exists even in your garden, right? Sometimes if you go in your garden and if you observe carefully, you can see the little microclimate in action. If you do composting and distribute that compost, or the the leaves which fall in your garden as mulch, you can re-establish some of this organic cycle back into even your own garden soil. You can observe it there. So this green chart actually talks about what is meant by microclimate, and a lot of it has got to do with heat, water retention, biodiversity, reuse of vegetation, and so on and so forth, right? Rainfall and so on and so forth. Soil moisture. This is something that has to be guarded, because the absence of this leads to eventually the soil dying, destruction. This has happened in a lot of rural areas. If you go to lots of places in Africa, in the savannas and the rural villages, overgrazing, even in China, in rural parts of China, this has happened, overgrazing. There's been a destruction of the topsoil. The soil dies, the microclimate dies, desertification happens, right? The same thing is related to the flora and fauna in our environment. Insects, extremely important for agriculture and health. Temperature rise is causing an impact on certain types of insects. I don't know if many people know. I myself am learning this. So, sometimes we find bees a little annoying, and we run around removing those bee combs and hives and so on. Little do we realize, I don't know whether it's 85%, but definitely above 50% of plants exist due to pollination by bees. And this is a fact. If you go to the United States today, there is a crisis around bees owing to rampant use of pesticides, increasing temperatures. And so now you have in many people's homes, a lot of my family has in their homes, they're growing bees. Right? So all of this, if you look, can be related back to temperature rise, water, and so on and so forth, rainfall inconsistencies. All of this can be tied back directly or indirectly to this energy imbalance and due to our usage of resources. I talked about this a little earlier. So what else is getting challenged, right? Our geographical landscapes itself are getting modified in an unnatural and accelerated way owing to temperature rise. We are having melting permafrost, especially in the northern regions. of, for example, in the Siberian regions, especially. If you go and look at videos and specifically on permafrost, you can see the enormous impact it is having on even rural communities in Siberia. How does it impact in terms of climate change? Permafrost is hiding about 40 to 60,000 years since the last ice age of carbon material. That is now getting freed up in terms of methane emissions. Methane is deadly, right? Far more deadly as compared to the regular carbon dioxide emission because it eventually oxidizes into carbon dioxide and it remains in the atmosphere for a fairly long bit of time. What does this result in? Melting sea ice, polar and snow caps. Yeah, so that causes the sea level changes, but more importantly, we lose our little reflector of heat back to the back into space on account of melting of the ice caps. You know, it's not just the North Pole and South Pole. We have the third pole, which is the Tibetan Plateau, right? On which is ringed by our Himalayan mountains. Why it's called the third pole is because it has the third largest concentration of ice in the world, right? And a lot of that feeds some of our rivers, like the Sindhu, Brahmaputra, and so on which millions or billions of people depend on. Okay. And this positive feedback loop owing to methane, you know, more methane, more warming, more melting, more methane, and the cycle continues. What else is as a consequence of this melting of these snow caps and so on and so forth? Please excuse the background noise. It's my cat who's trying to get my attention, but please excuse that. So the melting glaciers and ice sheets is very important for us to understand, right? Impacts the water cycle, right? There is a water cycle which is established on the planet in terms of ocean currents, in terms of wind patterns, where humidity flows, how the monsoon comes in, and so on and so forth. With increasing melting of ice caps and so on, ocean salinity changes, water density changes, the thermohaline circulation, which is the great oceanic conveyor belts which carry nutrients and heat across our oceans, that pattern could change, right? And that could have consequences which we are yet to understand in terms of currents and wind patterns, all of which could impact us, right? So yeah, so there's a lot of things related, and we are seeing some of these impacts today on unusual rainfalls, severe weather patterns, all due to the heating and the consequences of, thereof that we have briefly touched upon. So we have talked about few things, right? I've just shared some perspectives on a few things. I see myself only as a communicator of climate change. I'm not a climate scientist. Just like you, or many of you, I'm sure, I read a lot on this topic. I have certain opinions. I've done some work here. I do have my own personal practices to mitigate this. So I see myself as a communicator, and so what I thought I will do now is just to connect the dots, right, and share some perspectives on how I think rural India is impacted. I'm sure each of you would have your own thoughts. Okay? So how is it getting impacted? And this is true for a lot of rural communities in India, in entire SAARC region, lots of places in Africa, and even in the United States, even in the central belt of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. You take many, many places, right, where owing to this temperature change, water depletion, over-exploitation of groundwater, there's been a gradual destruction of the microclimate. There's a lot of coastal ecosystem destruction, right, due to acidification, right. While we usually talk about land, let's not forget about the sea, and this impacts agriculture and fishing and all the core activities that we depend on for food. This also leads to a loss of livelihood, and in many cases, just basic means of survival. People do not have water. It is just too hot in many places, right? This is very evident, although we see average warming of 1 degree. In many parts of the world, the warming is far more than just 1 degree. Because as many of you know as engineers, average is a misleading statistic, right? It's just the global mean. This leads to mass migration to urban areas, and it puts further stress on resources. It becomes a vicious cycle. Urban areas become further unsustainable from energy, water, sewage, mobility, providing space and shelter. Right? So to quote David Attenborough, I mean, I'm, as I mentioned, a huge fan of him. I think it's a very profound saying that I think he made or quoted from somebody else, but anyway, I thought I'll put it here. Let's understand this. We have a finite environment. We have one planet. Despite our heroic efforts of ISRO, our Chandrayaan and Mangalyaan teams, unfortunately, they are not able to take any one of us to another planet at this point of time. So we have only this one planet. We have this finite environment. Anyone who thinks that you can have infinite growth, so-called infinite sustainable growth sometimes, in a finite environment, in his words, is either a madman or an economist. And I think this is a statement which he made about 10 years ago. There's a fantastic talk he made at the World Wildlife Fund at the Royal Society in the UK. So I think this is worth giving a very, very serious thought on what do we mean by sustainable growth. I don't have the answers. I think we all have to come up with an answer. So what do we do to stem the rot, right? What can we do? I think first we must realize, coming primarily now from an engineering community, I mean, that's the forum that IEEE represents, electrical and electronic engineers and maybe some more, right? This is a subject that impacts the entire natural world. So as we look to provide solutions from our viewpoint and our perspective, it is so important to understand how the natural world and human society works. This is a highly interdisciplinary subject. Addressing this is, I don't think, can be done by any single set of people. Now, technology can be heavily leveraged to identify, measure, track, determine trends for the negative markers, the markers that we have, for example, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth, soil microclimate destruction, what are the markers for that, and so on and so forth, to determine what actually is going on today. What are the steps we can take to improve it? Some of them are out of scope of this discussion and perhaps would be covered by some other tracks. But use technology to evaluate whether we're heading in the right direction. And apart from that, obviously, is to use technology in first local and to address local and region-specific challenges. Why I mention this is, I think it's important to understand that there isn't a one-size-fits-all from what I have seen and read. I think there are localized solutions and region-wide solutions required everywhere, related to soil, water, ocean, and so on and so forth. And eventually, how do we mitigate forced rural to urban migration? I want to be very careful here, right? I think it would be wrong of us to say that we want to prevent rural to urban migration. I don't think we have a right to determine how people choose to lead their lives and whether they wish to migrate to urban locations. The question here really is, are they moving willingly or are they being forced to move? And why are they being forced to move? Is it because of the negative consequences of climate change? And if so, what do we do to mitigate some of these? Few things which come to mind, which all of us know. There is nothing new here in what I have written, right? Efficient renewable energy sources for agriculture, lighting, cooking, and so on and so forth. How do we harvest rainwater? How do we manage groundwater? How do we manage water as a whole? Do we understand the water cycle well enough that we harmonize with what's happening in nature? The importance of biodiversity, importance of microclimate preservation and broadening that. What's happening to the ocean ecosystem and what can we do to mitigate that, prevent it? We generate a lot of waste. I'll cover that a little later. And education, which I think has a very profound role if we are to ever address the topic in any meaningful way. So, you will see in these slides, many of these pictures and images are courtesy a number of research sites which I have quoted in the beginning, and some of them you will see here, which I have read upon, which I found valuable, fairly well vetted. So that's where a lot of the graphs and images are from. Spent quite a bit of time looking at them. They are always, these things are always up to debate on the specific, whether the angle of the chart is this way or that way, but I think the general trends are correct. I think that's what is important for us to understand. If you look at this specific chart, I think it will point out certain inconvenient truths. How much ever we think technology is the cure-all for anything, I personally don't believe that is the case. I think we can partially address some of this. I think a lot of it is up to us as individuals and societies and countries, how we consume what we believe is a sustainable, quote-unquote, sustainable lifestyle. If you see, according to this study, and David Attenborough also talks about this, I think a number of people are talking about this today. Our population, when I was born, probably was about 3 billion or 4 billion maybe. I remember in school it passing 5 and then 6. And now we are at about 7.4 billion, heading to about 9 to 10 billion. We are already struggling in terms of resources with 7.4 billion. In a rapidly changing ecosystem which is being negatively hurt. So it's yet to be seen what we need to do and how we will manage by 2050 a population of 9 to 10 billion. So there are certain suggestions here on this chart. It's an inconvenient truth, but it's not something that we can ignore on population. Leaving that aside, I think the rest of it is fairly evident in terms of, we talk a lot about the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. There's so much of emphasis given on recycling, but not enough emphasis on reduce. We can't substitute our way of life of fossil fuels and increasing energy consumption by just substituting it with yet another form of energy. That's my personal view. And if over the next tomorrow, I'm just going to touch upon some of the energy and education aspects. We can talk about switching to renewables, how fast we can switch towards that. But I think an underlying message that at least I am drawing personally, I stand to be corrected, is yes, technology, we should use it as an enabler for equitable per capita clean energy. Yes. But I think there's another part that we need to focus on. We have been very obsessive on, in the COVID-19 situation, of flattening the curve with respect to infections. Perhaps we need to have this discussion further on flattening the curve with respect to overall energy consumption. Green energy technologies are not going to come from thin air. They're going to be produced using the energy mechanisms we have today and the technologies we have today. It takes a while to migrate to totally green. So there is a curve, or there is a hump, if you draw an energy equation where, things will be a lot worse perhaps before they get better. The question is, what's that tipping point, and what do we do to manage that? This is my own personal intuition, right? I'm sure many of you will have your own viewpoints. And finally, if I was to look at, education, knowledge transfer, this is a very nice chart I picked up from the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization. The importance of technology as an enabler for equitable. And here I want to mention one thing. I think it's very important that when we talk of equitable, here I'm talking specifically of gender and societal equitable availability and distribution on access to flow of knowledge and education. I think with a much better educated women workforce, and I'm not talking urban, I'm talking rural, where households, where women have access to education and are strongly encouraged for that, my personal belief is that a lot of things will get better. And I think this has been proven many times. And, so I'll talk more about education tomorrow, share certain perspectives. And so the last two topics are for tomorrow. So I just wanted to summarize by saying that, climate change is real. There are lots of causes, lots of effects, some of which are covered here. I think the general trends are right. The general impacts are right. The specific numbers one can argue against, but I don't think we can hide from the reality. We need to step back from just a human-centric view and look at what's happening to our overall ecosystems and the natural world which we depend on. Unfortunately, we have a negative impact on the natural world, so they kind of are impacted by us, but let's understand that they don't depend on us. We depend on them. Right? So it's in our interest to mitigate the effects of climate change and to provide an harmonious balance between us and the natural world. And with this, we will just conclude on this very high-level, broad brush around this topic. And as I said, I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm a vested individual just like any one of you. And this keeps me up at night trying to figure out what to do. So I will try to answer any questions, and there may be many that I don't have answers for, to which we collectively have to provide answers. So with this, I hand it back to Puneet, and thank you for your attention and your patience in listening to this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir, for providing your wonderful perspective on climate change and its impact on geography, landscape, and rural world. You have rightly said that technology can partially address climate change. The rest is up to individuals, societies, and countries. So you have rightly said that one should practice 3 Rs: reduce, reuse, recycle, and at the end flattening the energy curve, taking cue from our COVID-19. You have nicely summarizes that equal access to resources and power for food security and climate changes are required, which you are going to cover in next presentation. We are already having multiple questions, so I will, in the paucity of time, we will take one by one quickly, and I request you to reply them. First question, immediately I will go. What is Kyoto?
I can see the questions in the chat. Should I go over them one by one to the best that I can? Oh, you will read them out? Okay, sure.
Yes, I will read them out and then you can answer. What is Kyoto climate policy? Why is it some countries oppose it? So this is the first question.
Okay. Kyoto climate policy. I mean, see, net, all these climate summits are basically trying to put a cap on greenhouse gas emissions, right? And there's a lot of, in my opinion, limited opinion, lot of back and forth, a lot of quote-unquote politics around what the numbers should be. And these numbers are arrived at based on what climate scientists predict would be temperature rises which lead to all the consequences that we see. Okay? That's the nutshell. Whether it's Kyoto, whether it's Paris, they're all about this. All have differing targets. I think the challenge is the following, right? It's a very tough decision, right? Very tough discussion on why do some countries, quote unquote, oppose it. See, we have developed a system of economy. We have developed a system of understanding what is meant by development, what is meant by successful development. We have certain metrics arrived at that. And based on those metrics, I mean, countries like India and China, where still, especially India, if you look, a large bulk of the population is still resource starved. I mean, basic stuff we are not able to address. How do I go and address to them climate change and that now you need to consume less? Who consumes less? Right? So there's a lot of this back and forth. This is a fireside chat for maybe 2 hours or maybe half a day on the politics behind this. But it's just basic constraints and communicating to the people who voted you into power, what their desperate needs are, which all influence how governments, can act upon climate change. I think everyone realizes the problem. Of course, there are certain skeptics here and there and so on and so forth, but I think everyone realizes the problem. Question is how to translate it into something meaningful, and that's a very hard challenge. Obviously, it's hard because nobody has solved it till date. And, maybe collectively together we can come up with better ways to address it. That's pretty much I'll say.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. Now we will go quickly because questions are increasing. So I will read only questions so that you can quickly answer that. What are the plans proposed by Indian government to use the renewable energy?
I think Indian government has been pushing renewable energy very significantly, especially in terms of solar parks and so on. I think Shri Ashok Das, covered that quite well in his Monday session. So solar grids, whether it is micro, pico, or nano solar grids, wind farms. India has very large investments of solar technologies, I think in Gujarat, in some parts of Karnataka, Telangana, and so on. Wind farms in north central Karnataka. So there are there's a lot of push for renewable technology. Solar, lots of homes increasingly you will find not just solar heating, but even solar for power and feeding power back into the grid. Now, question is how well that is working. That's a different problem, right? But I think there's a lot of push by government in renewables. And I also see a lot of underprivileged families getting, solar lighting and so on and so forth, where devices providing not only lighting but also, power to charge cell phones and things like that. So I think government is doing as best as it can, and could more be done, of course, but I think within its limits, it's okay.
Yeah. Next question is, livestock seems to contribute to methane, but But your graph
Yeah.
from 1950 to 2018 does not show significant change in the methane production.
Yeah, so I mean, I did not explicitly cover that. Livestock has a methane. This figure here, I hope you can still see the screen. You can see the methane emissions from livestock. I mean, just represented here, right? The amount of emissions, yes, methane emission from livestock is very significant, and this leads to a very sets of inconvenient questions, right? Which is what I pointed out in the last set of slides. If you say livestock contributes a lot to methane, and probably it does it mean that we have to change our dietary habits, eating habits, and so on and so forth? That's a sensitive topic, right? And it's not something that is easily answerable, right? It's covered here in terms of vegan diets, vegetarian diets, and so on and so forth, right? But that's as best as anyone can answer, but then it's also personal choice. We have to choose what we want now out of this. There are certain recommendations here, certain inconvenient truths here, but it's for us to choose now.
Yes, you have rightly said that it is we who what we are going to decide and how we are going to make our future. Next question is how the scientist would have interpolated the CO2 ppm over millions of years ago.
Yeah, this they do by digging cores, especially in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, because they have they have frozen over millennia, and so the ice sheet has built over millennia, and the gases are trapped there. Actually, I had a colleague of mine, in a previous organization who worked in the UK. He's a physicist from Oxford. So he's one of the people who has actually gone to Antarctica as part of these experiments to measure gases and gas concentrations in ice core. So they drill many hundreds of meters, or maybe even kilometers if possible, if not more, and they get these cores out and they analyze at each layer. They know the age of the core, right? And then they analyze the trapped gases, and then they figure out how much of carbon dioxide is there. Very interesting science.
Yeah. Now, next question quickly, we will go to what's the scope of research areas in renewable energy, such as hydro and solar energy? What are the research areas in those areas?
I personally don't know too much about active research. I know there's a lot going on in solar and so on. So what I mean to say is I am not particularly very much aware. The scope, I think the scope is enormous. I think if I go back to, it's in tomorrow's slide deck. So I have a slide on photovoltaic efficiency. I think it's very important there, the amount of energy produced per square meter or square foot from solar panels, energy efficiency conversion, right? And lifespan of solar panels, and so on and so forth. Because all these are also factors. I mean, we can go en masse today and buy cheaper technologies on panels, and in 5 to 10 years, we will have another environmental disaster on our hands. How to dispose of all this toxic material from these panels. So I think while we talk of renewables, we have to be careful of the side effects, right? And have active research on to mitigate these side effects. So I think there's a lot on the energy, recycling, material science, all these areas. And for hydro, I can't comment on that. I think it's well-established technology. I'm not sure what more could be squeezed out. Somebody who's more familiar will be competent to answer that.
Yeah. So now going to next question quickly. Many educated oppose odd even system used in Delhi government. At individual level, what can we do to lessen the harmful effects of climate change?
Okay, so I will start with your permission about 3 to 4 minutes to answer this. Okay.
Yeah, please.
For the audience, please feel free if you'd like to stay on. I mean, I'm happy to stay on for as long as possible. So now this is a very important question. I'm glad for whoever asked this question. It's as follows, right? So I'm drawing from a personal example. I'm not saying that my example is very good or anything or boasting about that or anything. So please don't get me wrong, okay? I have been an electric car user for the last 15 years in India. I used Mahindra Reva for first 9 to 10 years, the lead acid car. And then now I'm into my 5th year on E2O. Now, let's look just at buying an electric. Today, electric vehicles are there. Actually, Mahindra E2O is a good vehicle. Okay. Even the old Reva on horrid Bangalore roads in my area performed very well. I never once had a breakdown in Mahindra vehicle, electric vehicle, Reva, E2O in the last 15 years. Believe it or not. Not one breakdown. But nobody is buying it. Why? The question is why. So I hear varied comments as, oh, it doesn't look nice, oh, it fits only 2 people, and so on and so forth. Let's understand one thing, okay? This move to renewable energy, cost is an important factor. However, many of us, and some of us in this call and many of my colleagues or neighbors whom I stay with, can definitely afford the cost of adopting renewable energy for personal mobility, for solar water heating, or to do composting in your garden, or changing all your lights to LED bulbs, and so on and so forth. Right? But they do not. We are very happy in spending, forgive me, I don't mean to, be rude to anybody. We are very happy in spending our money in buying fancy vehicles. Let's get my next promotion, I will get one nice, I don't know what, Skoda goes or so on and so forth, or BMW's lower cost car, whatever it is, right? We are not willing to spend or have the mindset to spend on, let me buy an E2O. It's good for the environment. It drives brilliantly. I can testify to that. It's a 4-door car. 4 of me, I am 6 foot tall, right? I weigh probably about 180 to 190 pounds, right? 4 of me can comfortably sit in an E2O. I commute every day in an E2O. The last car I bought was my Innova 13 years ago. I have not bought a vehicle since then. My Innova I have filled fuel only once this year. Okay, partly due to COVID, but partly because I don't use it. Mindset has to change. It is as simple as that. You have to realize that unless we flatten that energy curve somehow, green technologies is one way. Nothing is going to change. You cannot wait for government policy or to make things cheap for you. If you can afford it, step up and make the change yourself. So, don't wait for subsidies and all these things, right? So make that change. And it's so important, right? This mindset has to change. If mindset does not change, odd, even, or anything, right? The government can only do so much, right? It is not possible to, do everything, right? It is very important to address this. See, flattening of energy curve and all requires us to reduce consumption also, right? Use public transport. This is chicken and egg problem, right? Until public transport is 100% fixed, I will not use it. Unless electric vehicle is cheaper than my Maruti Alto, I will not buy it. Where does this end then? Please understand, if you look at this curve, right, I will go back. This is increasing. This is not waiting for government subsidy. This is not waiting for solar panels to become cheaper. This is not waiting for anyone. Carbon dioxide and methane accumulation, net accumulation is happening every second. So unless we reflect on this chart very seriously, go back and introspect, right? We can have hundreds of arguments as to it's not cost effective, it doesn't work for me. Make it work for you. Just look at this chart, look at your kids, look at your grandkids, look at this chart and think what is going to happen. That should be enough motivation for you to see this. At individual level, try working from home. Now you're getting used to work from home. Hopefully your company is also used to work from home, right? It saves a lot of energy. Look at if you have garden space. Last 15 years, I've been doing composting with my wife. We have generated zero wet waste in the last 15 years. Our entire garden does not use pesticide. I have a fairly large garden. It is only maintained through compost material from garden. As I said, Reva, last 15 years I have been using. I have stopped using my Innova. My Innova has done 60,000 kilometers in 13 years. So you can see the amount of usage. I feel guilty having it. Every day I'm looking to get rid of it and get another E2O. There are these. I have only solar water heating for the last 15 years. I don't have geyser. I'm looking actively at putting solar panels in my house and giving energy back to the grid, but only if the panels are of good quality. I don't want to create problem by buying some cheap things from somewhere and having the problem of recycling. So there are multiple things. Organic, buy organic produce. That's another thing I will encourage, right? Because one is buy local produce. Why is local produce important? Because the energy required for transporting it is mitigated. You don't need to eat apple from Australia. You can eat apple from Shimla. You can eat Musambi from Karnataka. You don't need oranges from Spain or from Turkey, right? Same thing with cooking materials. So last 6 years, all our cooking materials is only sourced from villages in India. They are organizations, traditional cookware, because they are healthier. You give a livelihood to those people also. So if you look, there are many, many things that each one of us can do without waiting for government to step in, without getting subsidy and all that. Many of us in this call, we are in the privileged society of India. We can afford to take a little extra step. And when we do this, right, I think it will change the cost dynamics and make it more affordable. If we don't do it, who will do it? This serious question for each one of us to reflect on. Just go back, think about this chart, think about your kids and your grandkids, and I think there is enough motivation. There are enough avenues for making a small impact, however small. Right? We have to realize it's not just the future is not, I'm using green technology or I'm driving an electric car, it is very cool. The goal is right in front of us. Let us stop unnatural extinction of the species, unnatural change of the geographical landscape, global warming leading to massive destruction, and the sixth extinction. Please read that book. Right? It will give so much of insights for you. Right? We are the custodians for the next generation. It is our generation that has to fix this energy imbalance problem. By the time I am 50 years old, another 30 years, maybe, I don't know, after that boarding pass and ticket, right, to somewhere. I am going to leave this planet in some state. It's my job, just as it is anyone else's job, to see that we leave it in some reasonable shape. So I will just end with, I will answer to that specific question. Sorry, I had to take a few minutes for that.
No issue, sir. I think to summarize, we should be the change what we want to see. That way I can summarize it, and quickly I will go to the next question.
Sure.
What are the suggestions we can give to the farmer to retain the soil health?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I'm trying to find that question here.
Yeah, what are the suggestions we can give to the farmer to retain the soil health?
Soil health. Organic farming practices have actually addressed a lot of this. The fundamental principle around organic farming is not around yield. Yes, yield may be less than chemical based, but is around keeping soil health. That is a fundamental difference between organic farming and the chemical farming. So there are lots of technologies available. You look at technologies like permaculture. There's phenomenal work done by certain people over the last 20, 25 years, where there's a lot of re-greening and pushing back desertification which has happened. There are fantastic examples of that in China, some parts of Africa and Ethiopia, Ethiopian highlands. They have pushed back the desertification there. You know what will happen if Ethiopian highlands get desertified? The river Nile starts in the Ethiopian highlands as it goes into the Sudan and so on, and then into Egypt. Those highlands are destroyed. That is the end of, I don't know how many tens of millions of people. So they have pushed back successfully, using lots of principles around permaculture, around preservation of grasslands, around techniques around grazing, and so on and so forth, right? There are a number of quote-unquote technologies. These are not IT technologies or electronic technologies. These are technologies related to soil preservation, biodiversity preservation, how grazing should be done, what should be allowed to grow, not having monoculture, and so on and so forth. So there are so many such examples. So I'll be happy to share many of them. Time permitting, I'm happy to even do one day, show you many videos to the audience, and you can see the wonderful work done by so many people which I have learned a lot from. Some of it I apply every day in my little garden and I see some effects over a month or two.
Thank you very much, sir. We will definitely have this session sometime when we are free, because continuously now we are doing this, and after that when we are free we will have this separate session on this agriculture.
Sure.
Next question, if we go back and see, there was less population and less consumption of resources. But if we look at present and future, we can't control the rise in population and in turn the resources. But all know this, but still it is increasing because these are human basic needs like water, food, shelter. My question is how to stop this?
How to stop this? Very good question. I don't think anyone has an answer. So let me answer the question in a different way, okay? So just to give some perspective. I will share offline a video. Please listen to it. It is again by, I think it's by David Attenborough only. And he talks about, no, it's not by David Attenborough, it's by somebody else. I'll tell you. And he talks about energy consumption, okay? So unit of energy consumption. So if you take, just to explain this in a simple way, 1 unit of energy consumption is required for a decent life, okay? That is water, power, and so on and so forth. An average person in Africa, okay, in Rwanda and so on, consumes about 0.25 units, okay? That's all. Somebody in India is around 0.6 units. Western Europe is around 4 units per capita. United States is close to 8 units. So the question really for us is, what do we define as growth? What do we define as quality of life? What do we define as success, quote unquote, economic or life-based success? I think we have to, that's why I'm saying this is a very interdisciplinary subject. We have to start seriously revisiting all this. If we want everyone to have a villa-style lifestyle for all 9 billion people on this earth, you will need about 3 Earths minimum. We don't have 3 Earths. We have only one. Actually, we probably have 3/4 with the amount of depletion that we have done. So this is a social and mindset problem that we have to think about. And that is why education is so important. I'll cover some of this tomorrow. And the reason is because we are attuned to a system of thinking that we attribute success and growth perhaps in a very narrow definition. Unless we start changing that, no amount of technology or no amount of praying is going to help. Okay, we will continue population growth, we will continue depleting resources, and like coronavirus situation today, look at coronavirus situation. The well-off, the people middle class and above are the ones who are managing reasonably well. It is the underprivileged and lower class from economic standpoint who are greater sufferers. The same is going to happen with climate change. And it will be far worse. You will find tens or hundreds of millions of climate refugees, all poor people. And it is going to be because we have not changed what we define as measures of life that we want to lead. So answer to your question is, unless we change that, nothing is going to change. We can flatten the curve only by changing this mindset along with adoption of technology, which will hopefully reduce or level off our emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and the energy curve therefore. Otherwise, if we just substitute green energy, fossil fuel with green energy, and the green energy consumes more. For example, instead of 1 CFL bulb, you now have 100 LED lights in your house. There is no point. You've taken green energy, wonderful, but you still haven't changed anything. You made things worse. Okay, so long answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. We will take last question of today's presentation, even though we are having a lot of questions left, but we will be taking tomorrow because 7:30 onwards, I have another meeting. So we have to clear this next. So last question, could you please touch upon the circumstances leading to the extent of deforestation in Borneo? This, I believe, would have resemblance to the other part of the countries.
Yeah, so if I go back to the Borneo situation, right, I'll just bring up that little graphic. I'll just move this chat window. So deforestation in Borneo was primarily caused by a couple of issues, right? One is the island of Borneo is very rich in certain types of soil, which is very conducive for fossil fuel. So it's rich in peat and very rich in oil and natural gas. Now, the conditions of soil were also very, very good for growth of palm oil, right? You know, palm oil, Malaysia and Indonesia are the world's largest exporters of palm oil. You would have heard recently in the news that because of certain unfavorable comments by Malaysian government, Indian government started cutting down on the import of palm oil. Palm oil is used in everything. I don't know what it is not used in. If you look, palm oil as a product is used in, I don't know, cosmetics, food items, it's all over the place, right? Now, palm oil, to sustain that demand for palm oil, there was massive deforestation which was uncontrolled. All politicians knew about it. Pristine rainforest was cut down and mercilessly burnt. And because the soil had peat and fossil fuel related components, the burning also became out of control. Okay, so that's what you see in these heat maps here. Some of this is due to burning. Every year, like we have Haryana problem, there is also the same problem in Indonesia of crop burning, right? And because there are also heavy paddy and rice growing areas. Apart from this is palm oil, and illegal deforestation and rampant burning and destruction, and then a lot of uncontrolled wildfires as a consequence of this burning. This has what has led to the overall destruction of the Borneo rainforest. You will see that acceleration in just the last 15 years. If you look from 2005 to 2020, you will see massive change. Maybe from 2000 to 2020. Right? It is because we are consuming. So the question is, to answer this question is, when we consume something, right? So I will take slight tangent. Please see this video by Kailash Satyarthi, Nobel Peace Prize winner from India a few years ago. The video is called The Price of Free. When you consume something, when it is cheap, please question where it is from and how you got it. Palm oil has made mass production has made certain types of food items very cheap, but it has a consequence. So we have to start questioning consequences of a lot of things. If you start thinking, you may think that you'll go mad. No. I think over time, you will start rationalizing these thought processes. Right? And that is what happened in Borneo. And it's irreversible right now. Back to you, Puneet.
Yeah, sir, thank you very much. We are still having some 10 to 11 questions unanswered, which we will be taking tomorrow. I think tomorrow I will plan for up to 8 o'clock because the way questions are being asked, that shows that how much interest is there in the audience on these kind of subjects. So thank you very much for such a informative and lively session. And you are leading your life by example. That's what we can say. And we are honored to have you on behalf of IEEE Bangalore section and on behalf of all the participants. I thank you very much. And participants, again tomorrow 6 p.m. we'll be meeting again. And the way you are asking questions, I think we will be stretching up to 7:30 or 8. So be ready for that tomorrow's session. Good night to all of you. Let us meet tomorrow again at 6 p.m. Thank you, sir.
Good night and thank you everyone. Good night.